How are we supposed to know that you're now telling the truth?
Basically, I've changed a lot in the last 2 years, and in being involved with Miss Lansing and others, my brother and I trust people a lot more, and we're in a position where we don't feel we have a choice, and I have very mixed emotions about the things that I've said here in front of people, and I know it's going to hurt people that I love.
You learned to lie as a child, didn't you?
I would say I did.
And you almost didn't get caught in this case, isn't that fair to say? You almost got away with it, didn't you?
You know, you characterize it that way, and you think it's funny, but my brother and my life was very miserable for 6 months before we got arrested, and obviously wasn't better after we got arrested, and isn't good now, and it never really has been great. You know, in some ways, getting arrested for my brother in some ways was a relief, and the changes that have happened are a relief. And I don't know what's going to happen at the end of this case, and we may go off to prison very likely, but you know, some good things have come from it.
The picture that's been painted in this courtroom is that you had a fairly unfortunate childhood. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. And that I think it's fair to say that your father was tyrannical, correct?
Fair to say that.
On his best day, he was tyrannical, correct? On his worst day, he was much worse than that.
I wouldn't say on his best day he was tyrannical. On his best day, we had fun, and he loved me.
In the Norma Novelli tapes, Lyle said they were not afraid for their lives when they killed their parents. Therefore, he admitted to lying in his testimony. No. What he actually said was,
"Wish that I could just go back and have waited. Just wait another day or two, see what happens." I mean, I can't honestly say now that I felt that they were actually going to do something in that moment, because now I know that they didn't have any weapons with them. Not that I knew for sure how it was going to go down anyway.
Well, everyone knows now that you overreacted.
Well, I obviously overreacted at that moment. No doubt about it. I fucked up. But whether something was going to happen that night, I mean, I felt like it was pointing to that night. But I don't know. You know, obviously it wasn't pointing to that moment. And I'm not going to go into court and say that it was. You know, I mean, I told my attorneys, I said, listen, I don't fucking believe now that they were going to kill me at that moment, and I'm not going to go in there and say I believe that now. Because I just don't.
He is saying that in hindsight, he sees they were not in danger in that particular moment because he now understands his parents were unarmed. Lyle at no point retracts the fact that they were abused or that he was in fear of his life in the moment they killed their parents. That is a widespread lie and misconception about these tapes that needs to end. In the Norma Novelli tapes, Lyle said he could manipulate a jury. No, what he actually said was,
I can move a jury, I think, more than
Paul.
most of these kids and him, because I don't know, I get very emotional, and I just, I don't know, I just affect people more.
Yeah.
The way it is, and I can affect people in a very negative way sometimes, affect them in a very positive way. People like that, it depends, and I'm obviously going to just be myself and affect them in a real positive way.
Right.
And I hope it comes across real good. I think that it will. I want to show them how much I believe in what my past, how much I feel for it.
You're right.
All the pain involved, you know, and there's no way any DA is going to get me to, you know, it's stupid. You know, I mean, I'm thoroughly, you know, I mean, I'm a product of what happened.
Right.
And I just feel like I want to make sure that the jurors understand that.
Yes. Yeah.
And every time I feel real sad, like today, I cried a lot today.
Did you?
And I feel like, you know, there's no way that I'll be on a stand and a jury not believe what I say.
Right.
You know, they're going to absorb what I say. They're going to
Absolutely. They're going to be hanging on your every word.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't give a fuck how many people lie, which they don't have that many people, but they have a few people, or how many people come forward on my behalf for all the arguments and opening statements and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You got that person sitting a couple feet away from you, and they're telling you things that are very hard for them to say, are very embarrassing, are very difficult. You know, and they're telling you that because they need to. They have to. They're being forced to in a way, but they need you to know.
I'm convinced the Norma Novelli tapes are this mythicized pseudo-smoking gun that pro-prosecution lunatics have willfully misconstrued to help strengthen their rather untenable positions. And actually, I'm convinced that many people haven't actually heard the tapes. They're just parroting the nonsense spewed by others of their ilk. And typically, I'm finding that their foremost source on this case and those tapes are the factually inaccurate Netflix series Monsters that purposefully distorted many available facts and elevated unsubstantiated pro-prosecution theories for entertainment value, such as Erik's homosexuality or the idea that Lyle and Erik were in a secret incestuous relationship that led to the killings. In reality, on the Norma Novelli tape, Lyle says he knows he can move a jury, as in compel them, which he most certainly did, because he gets really emotional when speaking on his past, because his experiences were real. The pain is real. He did not for a second suggest he can move a jury because he's a liar and intended to lie to them. In fact, most of Lyle's testimony is not emotional. It's given rather unemotionally. It's very straightforward and is very matter of fact. It is also deeply nuanced and comes across as highly credible. The parts when he becomes emotional is because he's tapping into something that's deeply traumatic for him, but I'll speak more on that later. In the Norma Novelli tapes, Lyle just seems manipulative. Right, this absolute dork is totally being manipulative in these recordings.
Let me whisper in your ear all the words, baby, you wanna hear. 'Cause you look so sweet and fine. I just got to make you mine. That's basically the tune.
There is nothing overtly incriminating in these tapes whatsoever. There's just a lot of parts that are taken out of context to demonize Lyle because they want a reason to see him as a monster, because he was being too honest and too forthcoming on the stand, especially all the moments he broke down and told the truth about the lies he had previously told. People just wanted to see him as a monster because he had killed. They do not want to understand the extenuating circumstances that led to him killing. And this was the first violent act he had ever committed, both before or since. He is not a violent person, and the people who have met him in jail have attested to that over and over again. So essentially, what happened in the Norma Novelli tapes is that Lyle stuck to every facet of his testimony, and at times he recounted it so seamlessly, it was apparent he could only be telling the truth, just like his testimony on the stand. There were no hiccups in his recounting the intricate details of the days and hours leading up to the killings, or when he's describing his irrational fear that his parents were plotting to make a move on he and his brother. Another thing that tells you Lyle is being truthful and trying to be as truthful as possible is his self-editing while he's testifying. Like if he feels he misspoke or he's being too presumptuous, he will literally walk back what he said and say, no, I actually don't know what they were thinking, or no, I actually don't know what they said. That's honesty, and it's indicative of the fact that he's trying to convey this with as much truth as possible. In those Norma Novelli tapes, he also discussed how real his pain was and how he had to actively work to get to a place where he could talk about the darkness of his experiences with his dad and his home life. He candidly expressed annoyance with Erik for getting him into so much trouble again and again by making silly choices.
This is the best thing. At the end of the letter, I write to my brother, please destroy this. You know what I mean? Like he hasn't gotten me in enough trouble already going to Oziel. I write, please destroy this. This is before we had even gotten a decision on whether the psychologist could testify, so you can imagine my state of mind when I heard they had his letter. Please destroy this. And I go, Erik, why didn't you destroy it? Well, you know, it was such a nice letter, I wanted to show it to my attorney, so I hold on to it, and then I forgot about it. I'm like, oh my God.
He was also just generally funny and entertaining. For me, the tapes read more like a behind-the-scenes commentary on the trial itself from the perspective of the defense, because some of the calls took place during the first trial, and he would sometimes give Norma a play-by-play of how well their defense did in court and how they destroyed certain prosecution witnesses, which they did a lot. Lyle's takes are really accurate, sometimes cocky. He does sometimes boast, but he was mostly cocky when his defense took down proven perjurers, of which the prosecution presented many, such as Dr. Oziel, who we'll discuss in detail in the second video of this two-part series. Also, such as the bodyguard named Richard Winkowski, who Lyle hired for 1 week in August 1989, who was proven to be a liar on the stand when he said he didn't go to a topless bar with Detective Solar, but this was debunked by the very next prosecution witness named Glenn Stevens, who said Lyle's former bodyguard was in fact there with him and Detective Zoller at the topless bar, basically being wined and dined by the prosecution to help set Lyle up. And that's a common theme that you will see throughout this trial. The innumerable people who were somewhat in the brothers' confidence that betrayed them. That becomes a very tragic trend in these two brothers' lives. Speaking of Glenn Stevens, he is another reprehensible perjurer who was proven to be a compulsive liar for no good reason and who stole money from Lyle's restaurant. Another proven perjurer for the prosecution was Donovan Goodrow, who admitted to being a compulsive liar and basically a con man way back when Lyle originally knew him at Princeton, which is why Jose and Glenn Stevens and Hayden and Greg pressured Lyle to kick Donovan out of his Princeton apartment, which Lyle was very emotional over and reluctant to do because he loved Donovan. That was one of the rawest moments on the stand when Lyle talked about how he loved Donovan and teared up.
Did Glenn seem to be encouraging you to sever your relationship with Donovan?
Yes.
Did you want to do that?
No.
Why?
Because I loved him.
And so Glenn's giving you this information, and then you get a phone call from your father, is that right?
My dad found out somehow.
It was really sad because Donovan was his ex-friend who was now testifying against him for the prosecution. Just really tragic all the way around. And we would come to find out Donovan was the only person Lyle had trusted enough to tell about his father's abuse as an adult.
Him crying and having a hard time getting out. He told me that he had been molested by his uncle, or I believe it was his uncle, another adult, and I felt very bad for him.
Why?
Because I knew how it felt.
And did you say something to him?
I told him,
Did you want to help him?
I couldn't help him. I just wanted to comfort him and let him know that I had let him know that the same thing happened to myself and my brother, and that it was okay.
How did you react when you saw him crying and upset?
I started to, and it was somewhat of a good, I felt in some comfort myself that something had happened to him, although not really the same thing, but
Why? Why was that comforting that it had happened to him?
I don't know why.
Why hadn't you told people, had you told people before this that you remember except your mother?
All of this was corroborated by self-sabotaging prosecution witnesses who came to testify against the brothers but inadvertently helped them. Well, despite being Lyle's ex-friend who lied for the prosecution to help convict the brothers, Donovan ended up being a critical, albeit reluctant, witness to the defense, because in a recorded interview with Robert Rand, In March 1992, long before the trial began, Donovan candidly mentioned that his ex-friend Lyle had told him about the sexual abuse of he and his brother and the disturbing showers and baths they took with their dad up until the time of the killings, long before the killings occurred. However, while on the stand for the prosecution, Donovan tried to lie about the fact that Lyle had told him about the abuse because he didn't want to assist Lyle's defense or help him in any way.
The two best friends of Erik and Lyle Menendez testified today. One gave chilling testimony, the other, we learned exclusively, may have perjured himself. Lyle's best friend said he never heard of abuse either, or did he? We've obtained tapes that suggest Lyle's buddy had the inside story. But in testimony today, he somehow forgot all of what he knew.
Also, Prime 9 News has learned exclusively that Donovan Goudreau may have lied on the witness stand and hurt the Menendez defense.
Erik and Lyle say they were so badly abused by their father, physically, sexually, and emotionally, that they were afraid their parents would kill them just to keep the abuse a secret. So, the boys' defense attorneys say Erik and Lyle shotgunned Jose and Kitty Menendez to death in the family mansion. The story of abuse was apparently supported a year ago by Lyle's former best friend, Donovan Goudreau. Journalist Robert Brand says Goudreau told him in a tape-recorded interview in March of 1992 that Lyle once said his father abused him.
He told me about his father. Basically, he said that his father had been abusing Erik.
Yeah, him and Erik. And
Lyle also.
yeah.
Donovan told me that Lyle complained to him the night of that dinner that Jose Menendez was sexually abusing Erik and Lyle. What does that mean? It appears that he has perjured himself. Now, I should point out the reports of sexual abuse in the family and the boys' self-defense claim only surfaced publicly a few weeks ago. The audio interview you heard, the interview given to journalist Robert Brand, took place more than 1 year ago.
This is significant for many reasons. One, a prosecution witness is corroborating the brothers' allegations of sexual abuse by their father. Two, the prosecution witness is on audio tape saying Lyle told him about the abuse in 1989, long before the killings, which is huge. Number three, the tape where he admits Lyle told him about the sexual abuse in 1989 was recorded in an interview with Robert Rand in 1992, a year before the allegations of sexual abuse were ever publicized by the court case. This is huge evidence. Once Lyle's attorney confronted Donovan with audio of his own voice from a few years ago, freely discussing the brothers' sexual abuse by the father, Donovan had to come clean. These are the defense wins during the trial that Lyle boasted about to Norma in the tapes. Basically, Lyle was glad he was proven to be a nice, generous, and honest guy in the end, and also having proven that anyone who spoke ill of him in that trial was subsequently proven to be a liar themselves on the stand in cross-examinations that obliterated the prosecution's case, including his ex-girlfriend, Jamie.
A conversation that you had with Erik Menendez, is that correct?
Correct.
And can you tell me, to the best of your recollection, when that conversation took place?
The spring of 1989.
Okay, now you had said earlier spring or summer, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
But you think now that it wasn't summer, but that it was spring?
I think it was the spring.
Well, can you get close for us?
It could have been around spring break, so March or April.
Okay. And do you remember anything you did on that trip?
Played tennis, went out with Lyle to dinner, those type of things that we did every day.
Right, but you don't have a particular memory that you went to Disneyland or you went to Catalina or you saw a particular movie?
No, I don't.
Do you remember anything about that trip in specific other than the conversation you've just related to us?
Just that I was here visiting and...
You don't remember the date you arrived?
Not exactly, no, I do not.
Do you remember the airline you came out on?
No.
Do you remember the date you left?
No.
And is this a statement of tip income from Casa Lupita? Do you recognize your name on it?
Yes, and that's my signature. Bring it
I
up.
guess my question of you is, do you believe that what Detective Zoller wrote down from an interview with you less than a month ago is the more accurate version, or the version you're giving here today is the more accurate version? Do you know what the Easter Bowl is?
Yes.
What's the Easter Bowl?
It is a tennis tournament.
Do you know that the Easter Bowl in 1989 was played from March 17th to March 25th? Do you know that?
No.
Do you know that Erik Menendez played in the Easter Bowl?
I know
year?
that. No, I don't recall. I mean, Erik played a lot of tennis tournaments.
Okay. And do you know that Mr. and Mrs. Menendez accompanied him to the Easter Bowl in Miami?
I'm sure they probably did.
If Erik Menendez was at the Easter Bowl March 17th to March 25th, does it seem unlikely that he was home for the conversation you've related?
I have not stated that I had the conversation with Erik on that weekend that you are alluding to.
Well, you said it was either March or April. Is that correct?
It could have been late February. I do not remember exactly when that conversation was.
Okay, so before it was spring or summer.
Late spring.
And now it could be February?
Overall.
Now it could be February? You were working at Casa Lupita in February also, weren't you?
Correct.
And if I show you were working every weekend in February, would you then move back to January?
I don't recall the exact time of this conversation. I think I've stated that.
But you did say spring or summer of '89.
Correct.
If I show you were working every weekend in February, will you then go back to January?
It could have been. I do not
It could have
recall.
been January.
It could have been. I remember the conversation is what I stated.
And if I prove to you that you weren't there in January, will you then go back to December of '88?
Everyone who spoke ill about Lyle was subsequently proven to be a liar. Lyle was never proven to be a liar on the stand. This is important. All available evidence in this case illustrates that Lyle loved his friends and family very much, was very loyal to them all, especially Erik, and that he helped people whenever he could and loved to buy people lavish gifts long before the killings. He spent a lot of money before and after the killings, and during both of those periods, he spent a lot of money on other people. This is important to note. This was also, again, corroborated by defense witnesses, but also several prosecution witnesses who admitted before the killings, Lyle was buying them expensive gifts and treating them constantly to lunch and travel. However, no one is arguing here that Lyle is perfect or that he never made a mistake, which we'll dive into his mistakes throughout this video. My point here is that Lyle's character has never been impeached to the point that his testimony was deemed to have no credibility. In fact, the exact opposite was proven again and again. Lyle's testimony did indeed have a great deal of credibility despite the mistakes he made and the lies he told in an effort to cover up the crime and then to later get away with the crime, which is important to note. He owned up to his lies on the stand. Playing devil's advocate here, the only time I can honestly say Lyle was being deceptive or manipulative on the Norma Novelli tapes, and in my opinion he was being quite naive and reckless in this moment as well, is when he was so upset about Dr. Oziel's outrageous lies and schemes that he suggested he would be willing to play dirty and lie to set Dr. Oziel up. And honestly, I don't blame him. Lyle then began boasting in this very ridiculous and transparent way that he can set him up and get some people from Jersey in there to corroborate the lies he wants to tell to entrap Oziel. And sadly, this is why some people believe he is manipulative. But for me, I look at it in a few different ways. First of all, Lyle is the product of his upbringing by a very manipulative, ruthless man who he often tried to emulate, especially after the killings.
Lyle idealized his dad, thought his dad was a powerful person. And so Lyle described a situation where he was a favorite child, in some ways trying to be a little dad, a little Jose, but not being as competent or skillful as dad, but trying.
I think that the older brother was much more like the father, more aggressive, dominating, kind of manipulative.
He basically tried to become his brilliant and cunning father, but failed at this childish cosplay in many ways. However, his failure to emulate his father didn't exactly remove the boastful or cunning characteristics he had picked up from his role model. Again, Lyle tends to boast at times, whether he's celebrating how well his defense team did on any given day, or how they impeached liars on the stand, or him boasting to simply try to impress the woman he was speaking to on the phone, who was Norma Novelli, such as discussing how many songs he had written and the instruments he could play. Even in the second trial, the judge wouldn't allow this tape to be used against Lyle because Dr. Oziel was so heavily impeached in the first trial and proven to be such a lying, scheming, despicable person that the prosecution didn't even call Dr. Oziel as a witness in the second trial. The judge also didn't allow this tape in as evidence against Lyle because there was absolutely zero evidence that Lyle had set up a lie to impeach Oziel or had conspired with anyone to do so, or was even capable of conspiring with anyone to lie. Because remember, Oziel was already testifying when Lyle was saying this ridiculous scheme to Norma. He was already on the stand and testifying. It was just Lyle ridiculously and emptily bragging that he would do it, and even asking Norma for suggestions as she playfully humored him. Now, to play devil's advocate here in Lyle's defense, he said he would only consider doing it because Oziel was such a good liar, and since he had entrapped them in a scheme for blackmail, which he did, that it would essentially take a dirty tactic to catch him up. Mind you, Lyle is speaking of trying to expose a man who was an inveterate liar, an extortionist, an unethical therapist who was sleeping with his clients, who was therefore cheating on his wife, a therapist who had lost his license.
While he's waiting to testify, the AG calls me up and says, well, Dr. Oziel's gonna lose his license. And I said, could you wait a couple weeks before you make him lose his license?
And a therapist who was accused of raping and kidnapping and drugging the patient he was sleeping with, who happens to be the woman who got the Menendez brothers arrested. So please do keep this in mind when you consider why Lyle was saying he was willing to lie as a desperate measure to get this man caught. And Lyle even mentioned it would be something he would have to do on his own because his attorneys, and especially Erik's lawyer, Leslie Abramson, wouldn't go for it because the case they were making was honest and supported by real evidence. And in coming up with this ridiculous scheme to expose Oziel, Lyle referenced his inspiration for doing so was the way his defense attorney, Jill Lansing, destroyed the admitted thief and perjurer Glenn Stevens and exposed his countless bald-faced lies on the stand, all of which Glenn owned up to in the brutal cross-examination conducted by Lyle's defense team because they were able to catch him in a lie. Because they were able to catch him in one lie, he came clean on all the other lies. Lyle was essentially saying he would be willing to lie to expose an even bigger liar, an extortionist in Dr. Oziel, because unlike Glenn, Dr. Oziel was educated and therefore better able to get away with his deceptions. At no point did Lyle ever for a second say he would be willing to lie in order to make his abuse testimony more believable, nor did he ever hint or suggest he would have anyone to lie on his behalf about the characters of his parents in order to justify his killing them. In fact, the exact opposite was said multiple times. Lyle had so much conviction that the truth of his own testimony was enough to vindicate him that he said multiple times the jury wouldn't even need to hear anything from anyone else, including opening or closing statements or the other witnesses, because he knew the reality and the pain of his own testimony was compelling enough.
You got that person sitting a couple feet away from you, and they're telling you things that are very hard for them to say, are very embarrassing, are very difficult, and they're telling you them because they need to. They have to. They're being forced to in a way, but they need you to know. And I can easily. I always envision a jury that finishes hearing me, and then sends a note to the judge saying, "We don't need to hear anymore. We're ready to give a decision.
Right.
We don't want to hear anymore. We don't want to spend another 4 months here." And that's what I want.
Yeah.
And that's what I believe will happen. I could be wrong, but I don't think so.
And he was correct in that. Even the prosecution talked about how powerful and compelling Lyle's testimony was.
You could hear a pin drop. It was very compelling. It was very novel. Okay, I'll tell you exactly what I thought. I thought, oh shit. You know, that sums it all up. Because it was pretty good.
And again, never once did Lyle say he would be willing to lie or get anyone else to lie to make his parents' killings more justifiable. At no point was the defense justifying the killing of his parents. At no point was Erik or Lyle's testimony that they were justified in killing their parents. They were trying to explain to you the circumstances that led to them doing so. So there was no need for Lyle to get anyone to lie about how horrible his parents were to justify killing them, because that was not his testimony. His parents were actually so awful, even the prosecution couldn't find a single character witness to say anything positive about his parents.
People who have such small contact with my father saying, this was the most intimidating, worst human I've met in my whole life. So that's why there was 0 character witnesses on my parents' behalf. Why couldn't you find that one person? Because they don't exist.
Therefore, Lyle didn't need to get anyone to lie about his parents, because they were just factually awful people who left horrible impressions with everyone they met. Even the prosecution confirmed this.
I couldn't find anyone to say anything nice about Jose Menendez except for his secretary. And everybody else had just these awful stories about him and what a monster he was. The loss of Jose Menendez, in my mind, was an actual plus for mankind. Jose Menendez was a really awful man.
Again, Lyle never once said or suggested he would get anyone to lie in any way to help make the killings of his parents more justifiable. In fact, he shockingly said the exact opposite. Lyle openly admitted that he regretted killing his parents, that he now realizes it wasn't necessary, and that he would never have killed them had he known what he knew now, that his parents were unarmed in that moment, and that because his parents were unarmed, his life was not in imminent danger like he believed it to be at the time. That is a huge, very honest admission that many people take out of context or like to willfully misconstrue, when really it actually proves just how honest and candid Lyle is being with Norma in those tapes. It was huge for him to admit he regretted what he did and that he now realizes it was an overreaction. But that is the nature of a heightened fear state brought on by years of trauma and severe abuse in many forms, which we typically see play out in parricides, especially double parricides committed by multiple offenders or multiple children of the same family. It leaves one with that level of trauma totally irrational when faced with a perceived threat. And that is the crux of the brothers' defense case and why they did what they did that night. To reiterate, Lyle only spoke of being willing to be deceitful to take down a reprehensible creep who was lying to hurt the brothers' case and invalidate their pain and abuse to exonerate himself. So, Lyle was only willing to employ deception to take down greater deception, and that is not only made clear in the tapes, I also find it very relatable were I to be in his position, because what Lyle was suggesting doing in essence is what many police detectives do during interrogations when they know they are speaking with a guilty, dishonest person like Dr. Oziel was. Police detectives often employ the tactic of using deception to entrap a liar and expose their lies and get them to confess to a crime. It's called maximization and is conducted during the Reid interrogation technique to apply pressure on a criminal to get them to confess. And sometimes detectives will take this to the extreme of even falsifying or lying about having incriminating evidence against the liar they are dealing with, which usually makes that person break. That's essentially what Lyle was suggesting doing, but it was a stupid and reckless thing for him to say, regardless, since his credibility is at stake in this case. But the fact that Lyle was willing to openly discuss needing to resort to deception to entrap a liar tells me he was being equally as candid and honest in the same tapes when he spoke of how real the pain of his childhood was and how afraid he was of his parents in the moments before he killed them. Just like how candid and honest he was in those tapes when he admitted that his actions that night were wrong and that they were an overreaction because he now knows his parents were unarmed. He was honest about all of that. So if you're going to talk about what he said here, you're going to have to talk about what he said there. He was honest about all of that. So ultimately, what the Norma Novelli tapes tell tells us is that Lyle is a generally honest person, notwithstanding his occasional boasting and his ability to be manipulative when he feels it would serve a greater good in his mind. For instance, how he admitted to threatening his dad with blackmail to save his brother. Furthermore, let's set Lyle aside. The fact of the matter is, the parents' abuse can be proven through means outside of Lyle and his powerful testimony, and even outside of the dozens of very credible defense witnesses who corroborated his testimony on every level, who knew him at all different phases of his life, and many he hadn't seen or spoken to in years, so therefore had no ability to potentially compromise. Let's explore the great deal of evidence that exists outside of the brothers' testimonies, which were powerfully nuanced and credible, but for the sake of argument, we will set them aside. And also, let's explore the evidence that exists outside of the overwhelming testimony of other defense witnesses who corroborated the brothers' testimony. What you are left with is still overwhelming evidence of abuse in many forms, including medical records, disturbing photographs, and dated documentation. Erik's medical records, when he was around 6 or 7 years old in 1977, noted that he had an injury to his posterior pharynx, his uvula, and his soft palate. If you don't know what that is, the posterior pharynx is the back of his throat, his uvula is the small little punching bag that hangs in the back of your throat, and the soft palate is the top of the back of your throat. What could have injured a 6 or 7-year-old's throat to that degree that it is mentioned in his medical records? Well, a doctor actually testified that this could have been evidence of oral copulation in Erik's medical records when he was 6 or 7 years old, around the time Erik said his father had begun to sexually molest him, including forcible oral copulation.
Did you see any indication in Erik Menendez's medical records of an injury to his throat area?
Yes.
Okay. Sometime in 1977?
Yes.
Okay, and what specifically does the medical record indicate was injured?
The direct quote is hurt posterior pharynx, uvula, and soft palate. Seen in emergency room, Princeton Medical Center. Okay. Healing well, symptomatic treatment. Actually, was seen the day before. And this is the follow-up note.
Is the report of injury in that medical record that's before you is 299, is that consistent with, could that be caused by child sexual abuse, in your opinion?
Yes, could be.
And what, do you have any opinion as to what type of child sexual abuse could have resulted in that particular complaint?
Oral copulation.
And I couldn't do it. So,
however, we do see an adapter. When he says, when he talks about I couldn't do it, we see him go,
and I couldn't do it.
Like that. And when he says he couldn't do it, I think he's reliving that moment. And when his dad held him underwater and he saw it coming, he's like, I can't do it. And he's going to get, I think he was worried about it all the way up to that point where he grabbed him and stick him under. This is a violent thing that's going on here. This isn't just something where he would he'd hold me underwater. The kid's flailing around, probably screaming, making noise. Apparently nobody else is around.
Mother?
Yes.
And when you were in Israel in 19...
Well, to use lay terms, he was a basket case. Well, he was frequently tearful, sobbing, hysterical, withdrawn, constantly chewing his fingernails, his fingers in his mouth.
She told me to stop it, and that I was exaggerating, and that my dad has to punish me when I do things wrong. And she told me that he loved me.
understand why there was blood everywhere. There was blood everywhere. Why didn't you hear anything? I don't understand. Try and think. When you left, was anybody around there?
Sex was happening. Did you, based on things your father was doing, did you form some opinion about his experience in these matters?
I didn't hear the first part of the question.
All right. Up until this point, if there's anything that you are going to find convincing from a psychological standpoint as being authentic, it's the past 10 seconds that we just watched. We're going to watch it again, and I'm going to explain thoroughly exactly what I believe we're seeing. This is nuanced and subtle and very consistent with someone who has experienced serious trauma and has post-traumatic stress issues. All right, so as soon as she starts mentioning that between those ages that the rough sex is happening, he starts leaning his head down. Starts scratching his head. This is a pacification behavior, and it's one that he has not been showing during the other things that have been discussed so far, but this one is particularly distressing. This is all very consistent with someone who's experienced trauma, but keep watching for 1 second.
Father was doing. Did you form some opinion about his experience in these matters?
I didn't hear the first part of the question.
All right. I didn't hear the first part of the question. This is absolutely consistent with someone who is dissociating. But when someone has been through serious trauma, our consciousness can become a little bit altered after that. But this is truly a moment where he, in a literal sense, could not hear the first part of that question. Not that he wasn't paying attention, not that he was not wanting to answer it, but he could not hear it. And for people that have PTSD, this likely looks very familiar. And I do not believe that he has the sophistication to fake that. But this, to me, more than anything else we've seen, this is a very compelling and what appears to me to be a very genuine reaction to post-traumatic stress.
Corroborating the idea that this injury in Erik's medical records is proof of the sexual abuse he suffered are these extremely disturbing photographs. These nude photographs were discovered among the parents' belongings in the home following their deaths in a camera roll documenting Erik's 6th birthday party. There's a nude photo of Lyle. I believe he was around 8 or 9 years old in this photo, which is pretty old. He is in the bath and one of his parents is in the bathroom with him and took a photo of just his genitals, which is so disgusting and disturbing. Later in the same camera roll between photos of Erik at his birthday party and things like that is a photo of Erik who can be identified by the birthmark on his wrist, and it is just a photo focusing on his genitals. These photos are real and they are extremely disturbing and obviously indicative of something very gross and dysfunctional going on in that home with regard to these two boys and their parents. More bombshell corroborating evidence of Jose Menendez's sexual proclivities or pedophilia is a member of the Menudo band who came out and finally named Jose Menendez as one of the executives of RCA Records who him while he was in the band Menudo. The band Menudo was a Puerto Rican band that had been taken over by RCA Records thanks to Jose Menendez, and Jose Menendez was noted as being obsessed with this band. This band featured young boys who were not allowed to age beyond the year 16. They wanted to keep them very young and vulnerable, and so when the boys would age past 16, they would literally be cycled out of the band and new younger boys would be brought in. Well, starting in the early 90s, members of this band came out and accused the record execs of sexually assaulting and drugging them. Jose Menendez was an executive of RCA Records and helped bring the Menudo band to RCA Records. At the time, one of the main people accused of the sexual assault at these parties was the head of the record label, whose name I'll put here. Then in 2014, a member of the Menudo band named Roy Oziel came out and said he was sexually assaulted by record executives And he said this on a show in Brazil in 2014. So Roy Rosello has been speaking out about his sexual abuse allegations for over 10 years. However, recently, in a documentary called Menendez Plus Minuto, Boys Betrayed, Roy Rosello finally is the first person to come out and name Jose Menendez specifically as one of his rapists. This is huge because it corroborates what the sons said about their father so many years ago, which was the reason Jose Menendez was killed brutally by them. You cannot make this up. You can't ignore these glaring facts. There is a reason they killed their father. Now you hear corroborating evidence even 30 years later from Roy Rosello, who said he was raped by Jose Menendez in his New Jersey home. This is huge.
Cuando llegué a la casa de los Menéndez, ellos tenían 2 hijos. Los vi a los 2. Uno estaba sentado bien en el pasillo de la entrada, con una cara tan triste. Ni me saludó. Yo sentí el clima cuando yo entré en esa casa. Sentí el clima de abusos. Yo sentí un clima tan pesado, tan cargado, tan negativo en esa casa, que yo me sentí mal. José Menéndez me dijo, toma este vino, es un vino carísimo, y tómate toda la taza.
Roy, I couldn't react because I had no control over my body.
Yo no podía
They drugged me.
reaccionar.
After that, I woke up
eso
at the
me
hotel.
estaba
I have no
tomando cuenta
idea
de mi
how I got to the
cuerpo. Me
hotel.
drogaron.
But when I went to use
Y
the
después de
bathroom, I
eso,
was
yo
bleeding.
amanecí en el hotel. ¿Cómo yo llegué al hotel? Yo no sé. Pero cuando yo fui al baño, I was bleeding. Y yo estuve una
I was in
semana
terrible
con un
pain
dolor
for a
terrible.
week. I could barely bear the
Con un
pain.
dolor
I
que
couldn't
no
even
podía
move.
más. No me podía ni mover.
I had
Yo
to
me acuerdo
pretend I
que yo
wasn't
tenía
in
que
pain, but the
simular que
pain
yo no
was
estaba con
unbearable.
dolor, pero el
I was in
dolor
terrible
estaba
pain,
tomando cuenta
and
de
I
mi
bled a
vida.
lot. I showed
Un dolor
Edgardo,
terrible.
look, Edgardo, my anus is bleeding. He said,
Y
relax, it
sangré
will heal
muchísimo.
soon. You'll be ready again soon.
Y yo le
That's
mostré a
what I
Edgardo,
went
mira
through.
Edgardo, mi ano está sangrando. Ah, tranquilo. Ya luego se te va a sanar. Ya luego tú estarás listo.
Beyond that, you have a letter Erik Menendez wrote to his cousin, Andy Cano. This letter is significant because Erik wrote it to Andy before his parents were killed. Andy Cano would subsequently testify in the 1993 trial as one of the only people Erik told he was being molested by his father. Cut to, I believe, around early 2000s, I believe around 2003 or 2006. Sadly, Andy Cano died. I believe he died by an overdose of sleeping pills. It was accidental though. And sometime later, his mother, Marta Cano, was going through his belongings and found this letter that belonged to Erik. The crazy thing is that in the letter, Erik is clearly alluding to his father's molestation of him. However, Erik never says it outright in the letter. So it's really sad that all of this evidence is coming out so much later that could have helped them so significantly during the time that the trial took place. More evidence of these boys' mental state at the time of the killings and how traumatized they were was Lyle's stuffed animal collection. Lyle had a massive stuffed animal collection that he was playing with well into high school. And this is actually proven. He was actually kicked out of class when he was 16 years old for playing with the stuffed animal in class and basically raising the stuffed animal's hand instead of raising his own, which is mind-blowing. It's simply mind-blowing.
You've referred before to your stuffed animals. I have some pictures up there.
That's my brother and I on Easter with some more stuffed animals that I got. These are more, these are new, and this Cookie Monster is from...
Can't hear you.
These are new, and these Cookie Monsters from Muncie.
So you...
Looks like me in the background.
So you brought Cookie Monster and had his picture taken, the new animals?
Yes, that's when I got Cookie Monster. And I believe that's when I got the Sesame Street group. I'm not positive.
How long did you continue collecting the animals and playing with them?
till about 17, I guess. Oh no, they all had personalities and names, and and they slept with me on the bed. It was a big deal. It was important. I spent any spare time I had, but I would stay up late after my parents put me to bed and play with them in the dark. It was very important, very special.
And did the rest of your family members know how important the animals were to you?
Yes.
Sometimes when other family members were unhappy with you, would they take it out on the animals?
Yes. Yes. The Cookie Monster, well, my mother threw a tantrum and basically broke him because the eyes were attached and the one broke off in a tantrum in my room. And sometimes I would find some in the shower soaked, which is usually my dad. Like the time my mother just threw them out the window when I met my bed. And there were a lot of instances where I was vulnerable there.
Did you get thrown out of class one day because you brought your animals to class and you were raising the animal's hand rather than yours?
Yes.
How old were you?
I was 10th grade, so 16. This was a card that went with some roses that I sent her. I love you. I will always love you, Lyle. It says, P.S. This gift is sent to you from Pookie, Webster, Cookie, Froggy 1 and 2, Theodore, Pinky, Dino, all the Teddies, Lammy, Medium and Little Cookie, Woodstock, Odie, Garfield, King Kong, Snoopy, all the little dogs, including Snoopy the Great Magician, Panda, Rabby, all the other rabbits, Zuki, the Man, Oscar, Old and New, Scooby-Doo, Bugs Bunny, Koala, Sammy the Snake, all the lambs, Paddington Bear, Pinata, Philly Fanatic, Darth Vader, Robot, the other pinatas, both lions, Shogun Warrior, my fish, Indiana, which is the name of my turtle, Chipper, which was the ferret, Velvet, which was the dog, Eagle, and not to mention me.
How old were you when you sent that
16 years old.
These stuffed animals.
Yes, but that goes to a much larger issue, I think, than just the molestation. Yeah, I think his discussion of the stuffed animals was really quite amazing. Many survivors have stuffed animals. I believe Dr. Briere, I read his testimony about that, and he said that. And that is true. I think many survivors do. Although I've never actually seen that described in the literature. It's something that people who work with survivors tend to know. But what was phenomenal about Lyle's use of the stuffed animals is that he really, first of all, he had large numbers of them, and he gave them personalities, and he acted out scenarios with those stuffed animals, kind of issues in his life. And he had personalities in the animals, or gave personalities, that sort of represented issues in his life. In a way that I've never heard from another victim, he, in a way, was doing play therapy. When we see traumatized kids, we often ask them to act out with animals, with puppets sometimes with a dollhouse, sometimes in sand play, their bad experiences. The difference between Lyle's acting out his issues with his stuffed animals and play therapy is that there was no therapist there to help guide the process. So his description of how important the animals were and what he did with the animals, he took them when he buried the rabbit, for example, some of them were there, and his collecting other animals that were kind of orphaned by his brother. This is sort of an over-involvement, or it's an excessive use of animals for to meet a therapeutic need. For example, one point that his mom had thrown a stuffed animal out and the dogs had got it and ripped it up, and he told me that he had been able to save the hat. They're still important to him in a way.
And a whole family of stuffed animals.
When you say a whole family of stuffed animals, how many stuffed animals did you get her?
Like 20 of these white teddy bears that we call them Pookies.
Why did you call them Pookies?
That was because of the Garfield cartoon. He has a little white or a little teddy bear he calls Pookie. When he gets insecure, he always gets his teddy bear. So I got her that because we were apart so much as I lived with my parents. And
did you think that animals would be comforting to her?
Yes, they were soft, and they had made me feel safer. And then when you're feeling lost, for me, it was very comforting. It gave me, you could have your own little family there in the room with you and play. And so I slowly built up a family for her.
Were the animals that you had like family for you?
Yes, they were. They, especially early on, but really all the way through my teenage years, sometimes they got me through the day.
How did they get you through the day?
Just taking me out of where I was and into this other world of these friends was very important to me. And as I got older, it was embarrassing because really, stuffed animals are for little kids. But they were just important to me.
Lyle had actually called out for help in many different ways multiple times. When Lyle was in grade school, I just cannot remember the grade right now, Lyle factually wrote an essay about a man killing a child molester. That's something that's not often mentioned. It wasn't allowed into the trial, but that's something that also corroborates the fact that Lyle was crying out for help for many, many years. Another thing that corroborates Lyle was crying out for help is what he told his cousin when he was around 8 years old, that Lyle doesn't even remember telling her. She testified to it on the stand, but on the stand, Lyle said he did not remember even telling her because he was 8 years old and deeply traumatized. Continuing in the theme of things that are beyond Lyle's control that proved he was experiencing severe trauma as a child was Lyle's hairpiece. How much more proof do you need that something deeply disturbing was going on in this family other than this 14-year-old boy was losing his hair to such a degree that his father made him shave his hair and get a fucking wig at 19 years old? That is not normal. It's very clear he was losing his hair due to the trauma he was experiencing, and his dad tried to cover it up by getting him a fucking wig. Beyond that, something else that points to Lyle's abuse, but we don't have proof of this because there are no medical records that attest to this, is the fact that Lyle was wetting the bed until he was 14 years old. That speaks for itself. Other proof that the boys were experiencing severe trauma at home is the fact that they had learning disabilities, even difficulties hearing and speaking. Lyle was extremely quiet. He was extremely emotionally repressed because of his dad literally bullying him to not express his emotions. But in school, his teachers testified that he had some kind of auditory learning problem. Erik had auditory learning and processing problems. Erik had problems writing. This is all documented in Erik's school record. So it's not relying on Erik's testimony, and it's not even relying on the testimony of his teachers. This is documented in paperwork that is filed at the school.
You were asked for your evaluation on whether Mrs. Menendez cared for her sons, and you said, in your estimation, she did not. Could you tell us why?
I can base that statement only what I saw at school. But generally when parents came in to discuss their children at the conferences, their concern was why they were getting the grades they were getting and what they could do to help. When we gave the suggestions to most of the parents at PDS, because they had the resources, they took advantage of it and they helped their children. And in the case of these boys, they never got the help they needed. And in fact, although we all told her, myself, over and over and over again, that this child needed some extra help, she denied it and would not provide it for him, despite the fact that she had all the resources at her fingertips. And this, to me, is a case of pure neglect.
At that time, a month and a half, and I was concerned about his performance. So even though I did not worry that he was going to fail the course, I wanted to call to the parents' attention the fact that he was having difficulties more than normal.
Mrs. Howarth, was there ever any contact made by either of Erik's parents regarding the interim report that you made that was in October of 1985?
No, there was not. They did not respond directly to any of the comments that I made throughout the year.
Okay. You mean they didn't call you or try and talk to you about what you had written about their son?
That's correct. They didn't ask for a conference. Parents often call on the phone when something goes home. They did not call.
Erik had trouble speaking. He had trouble hearing. He had trouble processing what he was hearing. He had trouble writing physically. He also was extremely emotionally disturbed. Erik cried hysterically even as a high school student. This is well documented with his high school teachers and classmates.
Now, was there a particular behavior that you noticed on Erik's part before testing?
Yes. If it were a test that he knew was summarizing an entire book, or if he were asked to take a quiz for which he knew he was not prepared, he would become very upset and he would cry.
And that would be in class?
Yes.
Was that unusual for a 9th grade boy to cry in class?
Yes, it's very unusual. Some 9th grade boys who were under the same or under similar stress situations will either be angry, explode in anger, or will leave the room. But most 9th grade boys do not cry, especially in front of their peers.
And what about when Erik received a poor grade? Would that also prompt him to cry?
Yes, and so what I tried to do in that, I assumed it was kind of embarrassment.
Did Erik appear to you to be a fearful student?
Yes. When he did well, he was ecstatic. When he didn't do well, he usually cried.
Now, you mentioned crying.
Yes.
Did Erik cry in class?
When he received a poor grade.
And when he cried in class, was this in front of the other 9th graders?
Yes.
Did that happen every time he received a bad grade?
To the best of my knowledge.
Mrs. Sharp, was crying in class unusual behavior for a 9th grader?
Yes, for a 9th grade boy especially.
The other children in the class react to Erik's crying?
Yes, they were very supportive because they were accustomed to this. He cried in his other classes also.
Moving on from that, we can even go to Kitty's therapist. So this is not one of the therapists that was hired as an expert witness for the defense. This is just Kitty's own therapist who looked back on his notes of dealing with her. Kitty's own therapist said she did not exhibit care or concern for her sons. Her obsessive preoccupation with her husband and his affair amounted to emotional neglect and emotional unavailability to her children. She only cared about Jose. He also noted she did not have a close emotional relationship with the sons. He also noted that she seemed to only care about the sons as a status symbol for domestic achievement and success, which is one of the only reasons they pushed the boys in school, is because they wanted them to be successful, to reflect well on them, but they never got them help for their learning disabilities, which is what Erik's teachers testified to. They said despite them telling the parents multiple times and in multiple notes in the boys' school records that they had learning difficulties and learning disabilities, the parents refused to get them help, and specifically Erik. Katie refused to get Erik tested for his disabilities to get him treatment for it. That is neglect, and neglect is abuse, especially if you're going to then turn around and abuse him for not getting good grades, which she did. Kitty's therapist also put in his notes that Kitty mentioned in 1989 that she was hiding sick and embarrassing secrets about her family. That speaks volumes, especially considering the boys testified that their mother knew about the abuse, and this is something they found out towards the end of her life.
So I never felt that I really had obtained the information necessary to really understand her. That I would say someone is, and if you want to use the word secretive, or the information just wasn't there. You could probably use other adjectives to explain how one felt when you're not getting the information that you're seeking. There could be various reasons for it. The woman never was able to articulate, other than there was some problem with her husband.
Another example of abuse that was documented in medical records was a vicious dog bite on Lyle's cheek. You can actually still see the scar while he's on the stand, and it was documented in his medical records as being from a dog bite when he was taken to the hospital. He was bitten in the face by an extremely vicious dog, who the parents kept around him when he was very young, and even kept the dog after it bit him in the face, and was eventually ordered by authorities to destroy the dog because it had multiple violent incidents with other people and other dogs. They kept this dog around their child, which is another proven form of abuse. This is reckless endangerment of a child, which also amounts to abuse.
Did you see in the medical history certain injuries which had been treated by other physicians?
Yes.
For instance, was there an indication that when Lyle Menendez was 3 years old on March 9th, 1971, that he had a injury sutured as a result of a dog biting him in the face?
Yes, I recall that, I believe.
While the boys were in jail awaiting trial, Lyle wrote his brother Erik a secret 17-page letter where he was pressuring Erik not to discuss the family secrets. He was begging Erik not to allow his lawyer to take him down that path with exposing and humiliating the family. Lyle was obsessed with keeping the family's reputation, as he had been taught his entire life, but he was obsessed with keeping the family's and especially his father's reputation after his death. Lyle factually eulogized his father beautifully at the funeral. Lyle continued to tell the legend of his father after his death. Lyle actually spoke with a therapist talking about his interest in writing a book about his father's accomplishments. So Lyle was heavily invested after the killings in protecting the image of his parents, but especially his father. Lyle also expressed on the stand deep regret at having exposed and betrayed his father, and it is one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever seen.
But really, at that point in time, there was a whole other issue of whether I would talk about this to anybody, and if I was asked to here, and I never wanted to have to do what I did here, and it's been very depressing to have to do that, and I felt drained since I've done it, and I felt like I betrayed my dad to some extent.
You said you felt like you betrayed your father. Why is it a betrayal of your father?
It just feels that way.
Why? After all he did to you, do you want people to think well of your father?
I just missed the connection I had with him, and I loved him, and I felt, I guess, very guilty. And seeing my grandmother and people hurt.
Do you feel like you've betrayed him now by the things you've told about him here in court?
I have.
How do
I
you
have
feel?
betrayed him.
How do you feel about having betrayed him?
depressed.
No one is this good of an actor, and no one is this could manipulate on this level to this extent where they can express to you how deeply saddened they were that they had betrayed their father because they had exposed their father's abuse, and how he felt guilty and depressed over that. That's just such a convoluted mindset. It can only be derived from a deep place of trauma and someone who is mentally and emotionally disturbed. That sort of logic would not occur to just a manipulative person who's trying to trick a bunch of people. That stems from trauma. That is real. Just as real as Lyle still playing with stuffed animals when he was in high school. Just as real as Lyle's hair loss that led to him needing a wig by the time he was 19. That is real proof of this man's trauma. More proof of the parents' abuse and dysfunction was the fact that Kitty brought a gun in front of Erik and told him that she was going to kill somebody. And there is proof of this purchase of this gun, which proves that Kitty was very mentally unwell.
Now, with respect to one of these rifles, you say that you knew that your mother had purchased it a year before?
Yes,
And how did you know she bought a gun a year before?
because I was with her.
First of all, Mr. Menendez, let me call your attention to the signature on the bottom of this page. Do you recognize the handwriting?
Yes, it's my mom's handwriting.
And do you recognize this as a receipt for the purchase of a .22 caliber rifle or .22 caliber gun?
Yes.
Kitty's therapist also proved that Kitty was unwell by saying Kitty tracked down her husband's mistress to New York and stalked her on the streets and took photographs of this woman's house and walked past her on the streets. So when she brought the gun at the same time, it was with the idea in mind of likely killing the mistress or her husband. This was all done in front of Erik, traumatizing him to no end emotionally. But what's significant about the gun purchase is that it corroborates the idea that the brothers were afraid of their parents because their parents were armed. There were factually guns in the house, and these guns were removed by the police after the killings. More proof of the abuse and dysfunction in that household that's outside of the boys' testimony and outside of the testimony of other defense witnesses is Kitty's suicide attempt, which was caused by Jose's abuse and cheating. She went to the emergency room. The emergency room doctor testified at the trial to how disturbed she was, and the fact that she had borderline personality disorder, and the fact that she was addicted to prescription pills, the fact that she was unwell mentally, that she was very stuck in one way of thinking, that she was very extreme and erratical, that she even left the hospital against medical advice, so AMA, due to her husband's pressuring her to leave. So this is proof positive that Jose was an abusive husband who drove his wife to commit suicide, neglecting her children, which is also, again, a form of abuse, neglecting her children, leaving them behind, leaving suicide notes for them to find around the house, disturbing and traumatizing them emotionally. But also it's proof of Jose's abuse because an emergency room doctor proved that Jose came and took his mentally and physically ill wife out of the hospital following her suicide attempt because he didn't want any more of his own dirt exposed by her being there. This is proof of the severe dysfunction in that household and the extreme abuse that was going on in that household that led to the heightened fear state and contributed to the brothers killing their parents.
My usage of that term at that time would be the same as my usage of it now. A personality trait disturbance or a personality disturbance in our nomenclature indicates a person's behavior is characteristically fixed and is in a long-standing way either excessively odd, excessively angry, or excessively fear-ridden. So we have the odd, the angry, and the fearful. And we use the term personality trait disturbance or personality disorder, or I use it, to denote a person whose characteristic behaviors, and those behaviors obviously are a result of the way they think, their priorities, their emotional coping styles, their philosophy, etc. their characteristic behaviors is rigid or fixed and does not change or adapt when the situation may require more rational approach to a circumstance that is different and therefore requires some sort of alternative behavior.
Right. And why, in this particular case, did you have an impression of a suspect personality disorder?
I was concerned about that because I noted when I took the history that Mrs. Menendez was trivializing her circumstance, her overdose, or it appeared to me that she was. I noted that during some of the time while I was there, while I was writing notes, while I was talking to the nurses, that she seemed quite frightened. There was an interaction between her and her husband, which resulted in both of them wanting her to leave as soon as possible. They did sign out against medical advice. There was a sense, in my opinion, that she was not being honest.
Then you can move on to examine the many self-sabotaging prosecution witnesses and perjurers that helped the Menendez case inadvertently, and they also helped to prove Lyle's credibility. Harry Berman, Donovan Gaudreau, the boat captain, and Glenn Stevens, to name a few. All of these men came to testify for the prosecution, but inadvertently proved Lyle was a decent, good-hearted person, that he was truly fearful before the killings, and that his father had been abusing him before the killings. All of that was proven by these prosecution witnesses. Donovan Gaudreau also helped to prove that even at 21 years old, Lyle was still showering and bathing with his father up until the time of his death, and he thought it was normal.
Partly because there were so many things that I was confused about and so sad about that I was just telling him a lot of things about my life that I felt. I was trying to hide certain things, but certain things just came out.
Did you then tell Detective Zoller, we wanted to go to college really bad. We were getting away from him, you know. We were trying to stay away and doing other things. Do you remember telling him that?
Yes.
Who was the him you were telling him you were trying to get away from?
Dad.
Did he follow up on that? Did he ask you why were you trying to get away from him?
No.
And finally, one of the biggest proofs that these boys were severely abused and traumatized, and I don't even think I've listed them all here. I'm sure there are plenty that I'm missing, but one of the biggest proofs outside of Lyle and Erik's testimony and outside of the defense witnesses' testimony is the rarity of parricide itself and the rarity of the double parricide these two boys committed. The act in and of itself proves abuse statistically. So here I have illustrated that you can say all you want that Lyle was manipulative, but you cannot deny that every facet of his testimony was corroborated on some level by dozens of other, far more trustworthy individuals with zero motive to lie on his behalf. They gained nothing but they staked everything to defend admitted killers, sometimes against their own siblings. It was also corroborated by a great deal of evidence, even outside of the boy's testimony and outside of the defense witness's testimony, by the things I just listed. Therefore, the abuse cannot be denied or impeached. This is why the judge and the DA's office had to literally suppress and conceal the evidence of abuse because it was so overwhelming. They could not defeat the abuse testimony, therefore they suppressed it in order to mislead the jury. But apart from other witnesses, let's refocus on Lyle's testimony because it was actually very compelling, very nuanced, and very credible. It's credible because the emotion he exhibited cannot be faked.
If these brothers are good actors, they would put Marlon Brando to shame. This is not the kind of performance that even a great actor can pull off.
If you know anything about psychology and things expressed through the subconscious, it's easy to see moments where Lyle, the very stoic, brave man who tries to suppress his emotions and is often caught blinking back tears throughout his testimony, it's easy to see moments loses his composure and his ability to control his behavior, his expressions, and his voice. At times, he regressed on that stand to childlike behavior and dialogue that was downright eerie.
Yes.
And did he try to anally penetrate you with something else?
He did.
And what was it?
He raped me.
Did you cry?
Yes.
Did you bleed?
Yes. I just told him, I don't. I just told him that I didn't want to do this, and that it hurt me. And he said that he didn't mean to hurt me, and he loved me.
What did you say to your mom?
I told him to tell Dad to leave me alone, and he keeps touching me.
Mom said?
She told me to stop it and that I was exaggerating.
Which shows that underneath the mini Jose clone he was literally brainwashed to be, he was still harboring a deeply wounded little boy inside of him that slipped out at times because he was forced, after trying hard behind the scenes to suppress the truth, to describe dark sexual abuse by the man he loved and whose reputation he factually tried to protect even after he had killed him. He was forced to discuss in excruciating detail humiliating aspects of their very disturbed private lives, which obliterated their reputations among friends, family, intimate partners, and the world at large beyond repair.
Did you tell her that Erik had been molested by your father?
Yes.
Did you tell her that you had been molested by your mother?
Yes.
Did you tell her that you'd been molested by your father?
No.
Why?
I just couldn't tell her that.
Why?
I could talk to her about my mom, but there are lots of reasons, but mostly because I was just ashamed and I hadn't really decided. In fact, I had sort of in my own mind.
Let me go back. Why were you ashamed?
I don't know why. I just felt like that was not something. I mean, I knew that Erik had talked to people about it, but I wasn't going to say what happened to me. And
why not?
I don't know, it wasn't really, I mean, it was embarrassing, but it was really more than that. I just didn't want to say that my dad did those things. I didn't want to say the things he did to me. And
Why? Why didn't you want to say what your dad had done to you?
Because I was ashamed. I just didn't think that I could go through that. One problem was I felt, see, this was Jamie. I mean, there were two problems. One was Jamie herself being my girlfriend, and I really felt concerned that she would feel differently about me and it would affect our relationship if I revealed this to her. And, you know, talking about what happened with my mother was just not the same. I didn't think she would see it the same. And I felt drained since I've done it. And I felt like I betrayed my dad to some extent. There were a lot of things going on in my mind. I had a good relationship with my grandmother, and I didn't want her to hear those things from
Your
me.
grandmother, you mean your father's mother?
Right.
I don't think people get how significant the damage they did to their reputations was in this trial. The trial was never about them getting off scot-free. They always knew they were going to go to jail. They knew they were guilty. They admitted to being guilty. The trial was mostly about keeping them from being killed and then hopefully keeping them from going to jail for the rest of their lives. But they expected to go to jail for an extended period of time. There was no way around that. This is part of the reason Lyle refused to testify in the beginning. In his perspective, Lyle thought accepting the sentence for murder was worth not exposing his mortifying family secrets.
It was just very tragic for me personally that something I was doing to try to keep a secret from coming out was the reason that Erik, my brother, then said, and Leslie, well, now you have to. Your obsession with keeping this thing secret caused you to write this thing that the prosecution has got their hands on, and now you have to tell why.
I just need to read your handwriting. What is that?
I remember almost pleading with my brother not to let Leslie Abramson take him down that road.
It's actually proven in the 17-page letter he wrote to Erik that was later confiscated from Erik's cell that alluded to hiding the family secrets. He asked Erik to destroy this letter, but Erik didn't because he cherished the letter because Lyle was being so raw and emotional in it.
I was supposed to destroy that letter, but it was a precious letter to me. It was one of those moments where Lyle was really expressing his own pain, and I didn't want to just throw it away because that didn't happen often between us.
Beyond the sexual abuse, Lyle had to admit he was balding and wearing a wig. Do you realize how humiliating this would have been for a man his age with family and friends sitting in the courtroom, friends he used to act cool around, who used to try to impress, women he was dating, all heard this poor man talking about his wig and the fact that he was bald. Again, in Lyle's mind, accepting the murder sentence was worth not having to talk about these humiliating things that he was pressured to talk about. Lyle also had to get on that stand and admit that he showered with his dad up until the time of the killings. When he was 21 years old, he and Erik were showering together with their dad. This was normalized in that disturbed family. And this was something corroborated by Donovan Gaudreau, who is a prosecution witness who came to testify against Lyle. Another level of corroboration for the disturbing showers was actually in an interview given by Erik, who is the more forthcoming of the two brothers. And he gave this interview in October 1989, long before the boys were ever suspects in this crime, and long before they were ever arrested in early 1990 and needed a so-called abuse excuse to get out of jail. Erik is giving an interview to Robert Rand in October 1989 when there were no suspects in the killing of his parents. And in that candid interview, Erik is discussing these weird showers and baths he took with his dad with the reporter Robert Rand, because in Erik's mind, these showers and baths were normalized. And again, these disturbing communal showers were also corroborated by the cousins who had stayed in the home with them at different times when they were growing up, and they saw the boys when they were younger showering with their dad as if it was totally normalized. Their cousin also testified that she saw Kitty going into the bathroom with Lyle when he was 14 years old and helping him to wash his hair while he was showering and bathing. And this is around the time Lyle admitted he was having a sexual relationship with his mother until he was 14 years old, even getting in bed with her at times and touching her. And again, the fact that Kitty was going into Lyle's shower with him and doing weird things to him up until the time he was 14 years old is corroborated by the disturbing nude photograph of Lyle lying in the bath and having a photo taken of his genitals when he was around 8 years old. There is photo evidence of this disturbing picture being among a camera roll of normal family photos, which showed these photo sessions of them nude were normalized. This is extremely disturbing, distressing stuff and proof of abuse on multiple different levels. It cannot be denied. And it's also suspected by Dr. Conti, who was the clinical expert who evaluated Lyle after the killings, that Lyle's abuse with his father went on much longer than he was willing to admit, which was from around 6 to 8 years old. Because in every instance, Lyle was actually more forthcoming about the abuse he experienced with his mother and the physical abuse with his father, but it took a lot to get Lyle to admit to what his father did to him sexually. He was actually deeply, deeply ashamed of and hurt by this. He only admitted it to Donovan Gaudreau before the killings, but when it came to following the killings, it was like pulling teeth to get Lyle to admit what his father did to him. And because we know he was trying so hard to protect his father after the killings, it's actually not unreasonable to believe Lyle may have been molested by his father much longer than 6 to 8 years old, because we know he was trying so hard to downplay what his father did to him and minimize it as much as he could to protect his father. And he felt like he betrayed his father by even admitting it. So all of this is undeniable evidence of abuse. Lyle's molestation of Erik was a consequence of and evidence of his own sexual trauma. Lyle admitted to this on the stand. That's how honest he was being. He also tearfully apologized to Erik on the stand while Erik was sobbing his heart out at the defense table. It's a very gut-wrenching moment of agony for them both and for the viewers of the trial.
Gut-wrenching. And then the grief that they shared really between each other, I think was extremely compelling. I mean, you can't make that up. You can't orchestrate that.
This level of emotion cannot be coordinated or faked. It is from a real, desolate, and dark place. This is not acting. They are being horrifically exposed and crucified in the most mortifying of ways before millions of people, and many late-night shows and comedians in the media relentlessly mocked and ridiculed them for exposing their trauma to the world. That emotion and pain and fear they are expressing is real, and it came at an incomprehensible cost. Lyle's guilt over his molestation of Erik helped motivate him to protect his brother at all costs when he heard that the father was still abusing Erik and learned that his father was being so sexually violent and sick with Erik until he was 18. I don't care how manipulative and at times boastful Lyle could be. Mind you, he is the product of the megalomaniac Jose Menendez's school of Machiavellian brainwashing. Even so, when Lyle lets his guard down and finally tells the truth about all that happened to he and his brother from early childhood, it is powerfully moving because it is true.
I told him, I swore and told him he was a fucking sick person, and I told him no, and that he wasn't going to touch my brother again.
Or you can see the amount of pain and empathy he holds for Erik in his heart, which makes sense because all you have to do is think about the fact that despite Erik getting him into this whole mess, and despite Erik confessing and getting them into further trouble with Dr. Oziel, and despite Erik getting Lyle's 17-page emotional letter confiscated, which basically was a written confession, Lyle still loves and adores his brother in a profound way. That bond is deep and unbreakable.
I'm here in large part because I love my brother and wanted to rescue him. We just have that bond. I don't know if it's traumatic bonding from going through a childhood together like that, but we still feel it incredibly strongly. I never felt complete separated from Erik. I couldn't find any peace in it. And I told my wife, Rebecca, look, I need to be with my brother. I just can't do the rest of my life.
If Lyle was really a heartless, greedy psychopath who killed his parents for money, why would he have exhibited so much profound love for his little brother over the course of the 35 years since this crime took place, and for many years before it even happened? Psychopaths and sociopaths don't express real love or empathy, especially not if it comes at the cost of their own interests. Lyle is in prison right now because of Erik, yet he still loves him deeply. That is not the behavior of a heartless psychopath or sociopath. That is the behavior of a man who grew up in a disturbed family, but whose greatest source of love and home has always been his little brother, despite his father literally trying to brainwash all the emotion out of him from a young age. This is someone who, despite being moved out of that hellish home and engaged to be married and away at college, came back home and got knee-deep into the family bullshit to protect his brother.
I remember my graduation day pretty clearly. It took place at Beverly Hills High. My mom was there and my dad was there. I was really glad to see my brother. My brother spent most of his time on the East Coast, so I was really glad whenever he was out in California and I was able to spend some time with him.
I would have never told. I got Lyle into this. I went to him and I said, Lyle, I can't live anymore with what's going on, and got him involved. He was a way to go. They had bought him a condominium. He was going to Princeton. He had all the money.
So it's your fault for telling your brother?
It's my fault. And I got him involved and said, I need your help. And 5 days later, my parents were dead.
This is also someone who, despite being treated like a crown prince by his father, and whose sexual abuse was even performed under the guise of love and intimacy from his father, unlike Erik's more violent, masochistic experiences, and who was given the world by his father and the best training and education money could buy, this man still chose his battered, unloved, unvalued, crybaby little brother over the king who held Lyle's entire future in the palm of his hand. He chose his little brother over his father. That is not a small sacrifice Lyle consciously made, and that he unquestionably made in the end. But don't take my word for it. Let's demonstrate this. You can see Lyle's love for his brother in his eyes when he looks at him throughout the trial, and even after the trial when they received their terrible fate of life in prison without parole. And you can hear the emotion in Lyle's voice whenever he discusses Erik, both during and after the trial.
From the time you were 6 when you say your father started to molest you, how long did that go on?
12 years.
I was dreading my little brother taking the stand. Just because I knew I was going to hear things that I had not heard. And I still felt, despite people telling me that I wasn't responsible, of course, I did feel very responsible for his enduring years of horror.
And you can see it in Lyle's many actions. For the 22 years they were separated, it was Lyle who fought tooth and nail to be reunited with his brother. And it was Lyle's tireless efforts that finally got him reunited with his brother in 2018.
And we stayed separated for 2 decades. I worked very hard to try to get back to my brother, couldn't do it. And then I think as the culture changed, the corrections chief just decided that it was probably the wrong thing to separate them, and at least now it's no longer a good idea. It's definitely a very loving brotherly bond, and it's amazing how the separation didn't change that at all. 2 decades of being separated, and every day is sort of shocking. So to just see my brother, it's just sort of a shock. When I last saw him, he was a teenager, so he's just sort of had to grow on his own in the prison system. And at some point, I imagine he'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about it together. But right now, we're just happy to be with him, and we see each other every day. Yes, 22 years exactly. So it was just something I wasn't sure was ever going to happen. It was just a remarkable moment for me and really for my whole family.
They're now in the same federal prison.
I wasn't sure how I would react, in 20 years I just felt a lot of adrenaline and I ended up bursting into tears. It was just quite an emotional moment, almost unexpectedly so. I think for me, I thought maybe I'd just be numb.
Lyle Menendez is describing the emotional moment he and his brother Erik shared when they saw one another for the first time in 22 years. Their first words?
Just that I love you, and, just the word finally, I think was said a lot. Actually, very unusual for my brother and I to be separated.
He never gave up, even after 2 freaking decades of denials. Also, just think of how much you would have to love a person to kill anyone for them in the first place, let alone your own parents. Lyle grew up protecting Erik from his father and on multiple occasions was actually punished for it. His love for Erik also comes out when he's discussing the nature of the killings and why they were so ruthless, and why he even reloaded to shoot his mother more when he saw her crawling in Erik's general direction.
But could see somebody moving in the direction of where my brother should be. And so I reloaded.
Did you hear that? I don't think people pay enough attention to the major psychological indicators apparent in this statement. He said, I saw someone, not his mother, but someone, meaning in his disillusioned mind at the time, it could have been anyone, moving in the direction of where my brother should have been, meaning this person was moving towards his brother. So I reloaded. To me, this indicates that Lyle did not register his parents as his parents that night. To him, they were strangers and 2 major threats that needed to be neutralized at all costs.
Lyle's emotional testimony on the shooting of his parents is a great insight into his mindset at the time of the killings and the PTSD that had taken over his mind. Ultimately, Lyle was just an emotionally disturbed young man who was suddenly disillusioned after finding out how sick and perverse his father was being towards his little brother, and who then, as a result of that disillusionment and fear and his own PTSD from his own abuse, made a horrendous miscalculation in trying to protect his brother from his father. The last point I want to make is this. Let's talk about Erik's actions and remarks even after 35 years in the Netflix documentary called The Menendez Brothers, and how they helped to prove Lyle's noble intentions. And remember, of the 2, Erik was seen to be the more forthcoming and the more sensitive and the less so-called manipulative one of the 2. He was the confessor, and he willfully flew back from another country to face accountability and to be with his brother. That shows integrity, even after the hideous crime he had been driven to commit.
I went to the only person that has ever helped me, that has ever protected me. And then ultimately this happened because of me, because I went to him. And then afterwards, let's just be honest, he was arrested because of me, because I told Dr. Oziel. Because I couldn't live with what I did. I couldn't live with it. I wanted to die. In a way, I did not protect Lyle. I got him into every aspect of this tragedy. Every aspect of this tragedy is my fault.
Once again, I posit that Erik's actions and his comments about this entire case actually prove Lyle's intentions were good in August 1989. The brothers' updated commentary in the Netflix documentary is where it becomes implausible that these two men, now 35 years older, are still lying about every aspect of this case down to the minutest detail. This is not something that is probable or easy to do with two separate grown adults who have spent at least 20 years apart and who think independently of one another now. This documentary did a beautiful job of humanizing Lyle, who had been dehumanized by everyone so relentlessly. Again, what you often hear of Lyle is how controlling and manipulative he could be. I don't think that's a fair characterization of him at all, considering he was fighting for his life in this situation. Few of us understand Lyle's deepening plight from the moment before he killed his parents in an attempt to rescue his little brother to the day he was arrested and then put on trial. His life was spiraling in a very catastrophic way. Even in 1993, he was only around 25 years old. This was a lost young man who had killed his parents at 21 years old, now trying desperately to control every aspect of both his and Erik's life. And Erik is not an easy person to deal with, as Erik himself admitted. Not only was Erik often hysterically emotional due to the abuse he had endured, but he was also impulsive and difficult to manage. As Erik admitted in this documentary, it is because of Erik that Lyle found himself in this position to begin with. Lyle was his brother's keeper. The documentary did an excellent job of both men expressing their heavy guilt over how everything played out with the family, but also the guilt and responsibility they felt over one another. They both blame themselves for the outcome of each other's lives. And I found that to be some of the most poignant words either of them have expressed about this case. Sure, you may have one psycho in the family willing to kill their parents for money in a cold-blooded manner, but what are the odds you would have two? Erik falling apart immediately after the killings debunks the often touted theory that they were both cold-blooded killers who did this for money. And if it were simply the case that Lyle was a psychopath who killed for money and manipulated his brother into helping him that night, don't you think that would have come out by now in these 30 plus years they've been in jail and interrogated and examined and cross-examined and psychologically evaluated again and again and again? Even with a 20-year separation where Erik had to learn to think independently and figure out how to survive on his own, wouldn't he have finally turned against Lyle and admitted that Lyle manipulated him into doing this for money and that he didn't agree with him about committing the crime? Would Erik have expressed such intense love and loyalty to his brother if this was all simply brought on by Lyle manipulating him into killing his parents for money? Would Erik have willfully flown back from Israel to face capital punishment with a psychopathic man who forced him to kill his parents for money? Wouldn't this have come out in the confession when Erik was falling apart and no longer able to live with what he had done to his parents, instead of his unshakable love for Lyle, in which he expressed he would lay down his life if it meant sparing Lyle's?
And I cried about that one for a while. And then we tell people, why don't my sister tell me that you were really worried about it? Okay? Hey. No, come on, look at it. Try your brother. Well, let him needs to do this. You know what? This is part of your way of undoing what happened in the family. Erik needs to express his pain his way, and he needs to tell you how much he loves you and how concerned he was for you. Right? Erik, can you turn to it loud? Tell me what you feel. You can do it. Come on. You told me that between the two of you, if one of you was going to die, you'd rather you die and you allow left. Did you say that? Did you say that? Yes. Yeah.
Don't Don't you think that this depth of love and loyalty Erik expresses towards Lyle, even after 35 years, could only be born from the fact that his brother killed his parents to protect him and had in fact protected him from his abuser in any way he could throughout his life, not just on August 20th, 1989? The fact that to this very day, 35 years later, Erik is still expressing intense guilt over getting Lyle caught up in this entire mess, at the very least, proves the intent with which Lyle acted that night. Erik's extreme guilt over what he had done to his parents and his simultaneous guilt over what he had done to his brother's life proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Erik is the impetus behind these killings taking place, not Lyle and not money. You simply have to ask why Erik feels solely responsible for everything that took place, even after 35 years. If this was just about Lyle wanting to kill his parents for money. The truth of the matter is that Erik still feels guilty and responsible for his family tragedy, because when he was a scared 18-year-old with all the emotional maturity of an 8-year-old, he asked his brother, who was not much more emotionally and intellectually mature than him, to rescue him from his parents. And within a week, his parents were dead, with Lyle executing both fatal close shots. It was Erik asking for help that led to catastrophe that week, because he knew there was nothing Lyle wouldn't have done to protect him. Sure, Lyle made stupid mistakes during and after the killings that led to people mistaking the motives behind the killings, but when taking into account how grisly the killings were and Erik's words and actions, the motive could not have been more clear.